Bookstore, along with my wife, Lisa Muscatine, and we're really very delighted to be hosting Professor James Shapiro, who's here to talk about his new book, The Playbook, a story of theater, democracy, and the making of a culture war. Jim has advised me that the only person who was allowed to make a long introduction about him was his mom, so I'm going to keep mine short. He is, of course, an English professor who's been on the faculty at Columbia University for nearly 40 years, and for the past decade he also has worked with New York's public theater, where he serves as a scholar in residence. His specialty is Shakespeare in the early modern period. And most of his previous 8 books, which have won all sorts of awards, have been about Shakespeare. His new book is not, although it is about a theater project. It's a project that you probably never heard of, despite it having been very, very large and publicly funded. It existed long ago, during the 1930s, and was shut down after only a few years, accused by right-wingers at the time of staging subversive plays promoting un-American activity and fostering communism. What Jim has done so deftly is not only provide an authoritative account of this New Deal project, its significant impact, and the political controversy that arose over it, he also places what sadly happened to it in the context of today's bitter political divide and culture war. The smear tactics employed against the theater project by those who succeeded in killing it were much the same as the tactics used more than a decade later by Joseph McCarthy and found in contemporary right-wing campaigns. The Playbook's quite an instructive story, expertly told, with heroic and villainous figures. Reviewers have extolled the book as vibrant, fascinating, and captivating. A bravura performance, declared Publishers Weekly. I would imagine Shakespeare is smiling down on Jim, this present-day scholar of his. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jim Shapiro.
Can you hear me okay? Great. First of all, thank you for that lovely introduction. My mom would be proud if she was still with us. And I'm really delighted to be talking about the book in Washington, D.C., where much of the story took place in the mid to late 1930s. And I'm really happy to be back at one of the truly great English-speaking bookstores anywhere in the world. And this is my first event at all in promoting the book. So I'm looking forward to some, they don't look like a mean audience, but I'm looking forward to some sharp questions. And I'm going to speak for 30 minutes, and then I hope to take questions for as long as that if you can throw them at me. I want to say that I'm very grateful that old dear friends of mine are spending their 42nd wedding anniversary, Ted and Joe in the back, here tonight, rather than doing something. I thought it was paper or newsprint. I don't know what 42nd is. Maybe it is Politics and Prose as an anniversary event. This is the book, The Playbook. The Playbook is about the playbook or scripts of the Federal Theater Project of the late 1930s. The only time America had anything approaching a national theater. But it's no less, as you suggested, about a right-wing playbook, still widely and effectively employed, that was first assembled by Martin Guise, a Texas congressman who chaired the first House Un-American Activities Committee, and that committee targeted and effectively destroyed the federal theater. Our book recounts how the federal theater and that House Un-American Activities Committee came into existence at roughly the same time and explores the consequences of their collision. The chapters explore what's at stake in 5 federal theater productions that flirted with censorship, confronted the racial divide, tangled with Congress, tackled issues ignored or sanitized by Hollywood or Broadway, and expanded the possibilities of what American theater and culture could be. The story I'll share with you in the next 26.5 minutes is from a section of the book that recounts how, on December 6, 1938, for the first and perhaps only time in American history, the place of democracy in our nation was hotly debated in a congressional hearing. That fraught exchange took place a few miles from here on the second floor of the old congressional building, where the recently formed House Un-American Activities Committee questioned its witnesses. The setup was a long T, and sitting at the head of that T that morning were 5 members of the investigative committee: J. Parnell Thomas of New Jersey, John Dempsey of New Mexico, Joe Starnes of Alabama, Harold Mosher of Ohio, and its chairman, Martin Dies. Dies was a tall and charismatic Texan in his late 30s who worked through 8 cigars in the course of a typical day's hearing. While it was officially known as the Special Committee on Un-American Activity, everybody in the country, every reporter, called it the Dies Committee, and the other members of that committee were pretty much just a supporting cast. The committee had been authorized by Congress on May 26, 1938, and was due to present its findings 7 months later. Congress was uneasy with Martin Dies, who was a slippery fellow, and only gave this committee $25,000, not enough to go after its ostensible targets, Nazis and communists. So he went after lower-hanging fruit. He went after public relief, which many Americans had grown weary of. And he focused most of his efforts on the Federal Theater Project. One of the more controversial parts of the WPA Federal One. Federal One was a program that had put to work thousands of painters and writers and photographers and musicians and actors. Now, it wasn't easy for Dies and his committee to attack murals in post offices or concerts or photographs or tourist handbooks. Theater offered a much richer target because it was easy to find and read aloud obscene or offensive lines and link them to what was perceived to be un-American values. From 1935 until 1939, in its brief existence, the Federal Theater staged, for a pittance, for free, over 1,000 productions in 29 states, seen by 30 million playgoers, or roughly 1 in 4 Americans at that time, 2/3 of whom I should say, had never seen a play before. That offered traditional fare like Shakespeare, mixed in with contemporary plays on issues that mattered to Depression-era audiences, such as slum housing or the threat of fascism. It was led by a theater director, a professor at Vassar College named Hallie Flanagan, and at its peak employed over 12,000 theater artists, some of whom, like Orson and Arthur Miller, would go on to become famous, but most of whom were just ordinary theater folk, out of work, desperate to practice their craft. The Federal Theater brought children's plays on touring trucks to crowded city parks. It staged works in foreign languages to reach immigrants. It established what it called Negro units from Hartford to Seattle to support black actors and playwrights. It brought free theater to asylums, orphanages, hospitals, prisons, and veterans' homes. It revived playgoing in rural states where the movies had all but killed theater. And its weekly radio broadcasts reached 10 million viewers a week. Its popularity, which contributed to its undoing, confirmed that there was then, and perhaps now still, a hunger for drama that spoke to the unsettling times. Back in August, 1938. At the end of its first week of hearings, the Dies Committee had heard from a half dozen witnesses who, based on hearsay evidence and unchallenged allegations, had traduced the Federal Theater as communistic and its plays as subversive of American values. The accusations were front-page news. Subsequent reports of the wild and unpredictable hearings, which Americans seemingly couldn't get enough of, generated growing public interest. With only weeks left before the committee members had to submit their report to Congress, they had not allowed any officials representing the Federal Theater to respond to these accusations. Hallie Flanagan had been asking time and again to appear before the committee, and they had stonewalled her. They couldn't really do so any longer, and invited her to speak to them. She'd come prepared like a good professor, reports and affidavits in hand. No one knew the Federal Theater better than she did, or could speak about it with greater passion. Her mission was to defend the Federal Theater. Martin Dies was to trip her up, vilify her program, and in so doing, make national news and extend the life of his own committee. What Flanigan failed to grasp, and would haunt her to her dying days in an old age home in New York State, was that the hearing room offered a different sort of drama than she had ever encountered. That shop-worn set in that congressional building masked a nascent form of American political theater, far more dangerous than the theater she had come to defend. In the course of winning this battle, Martin Dies had assembled a political playbook so pervasive it now seems timeless. Long before John McCarthy began naming names of those he deemed un-American in his own hearings in the Senate, Martin Dies had instituted the practice. Long before elected officials discovered that informal legislative guardrails could safely be ignored, that journalists rarely followed up on false claims, and that emerging media could easily be exploited, Dies had figured all that out. Long before politicians would galvanize followers by threats of violence against their foes or brazenly play the race card, Martin Dies would, on the campaign trail, speak of assaulting a black congressman who dared challenge white supremacy. And long before politicians realized that it was easier to attain power by battling over culture and identity, even if that meant reversing where they had previously stood on specific legislation, Dies had shown how winning a strategy is to be. And as forward-looking as he was equally gifted at appropriating strategies others had successfully employed in exploiting grievances. Hallie Flanagan came prepared to share with the committee how much the Federal Theater had accomplished in its short life, and to defend it from charges of communism. She was a progressive from Iowa, and she believed that theater should be a thorn in the flesh, as she put it, of the body politic. But she never imposed an ideological agenda on the Federal Theater, and had pushed back against radicalism in her organization. The overwhelming majority of the hundreds of productions she approved were unobjectionable: classical and modern drama, religious plays, vaudeville, marionette shows, though a few contemporary plays had not shied away from controversy, and it angered everybody across the political spectrum. The State Department shut down her first play, and those in Congress who did not like racial equality were very unhappy about integrated productions. The cost for all of this, from 1935 to 1939, as she put it, was the price of building one battleship. When she came to Congress that day to testify, they made her wait. Before allowing her to testify, they had a local minister, the First Congregational Church here in D.C., who recommended that radicals should be dealt with by force, by confinement, or by deportation. He was allowed to go on uninterrupted. The second she started speaking, J. Pernell Thomas and Joe Starnes began peppering her with so many questions, as the New York Times reported, Their questions tumbled out so fast, she had to juggle with 2 or 3 at a time and was repeatedly cut off from finishing her sentences. Dies watching this, let it go on for too long, then intervened. Unwilling to cede to this committee what constituted un-American activity, she told him, when he asked what she was there to speak of, "Since August 29th, 1935, I've been concerned with combating un-American inactivity." That completely threw him off. He said, "Inactivity?" She said, "Yes, inactivity." He said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I referred to the inactivity of the professional men and women who, at the time I took office, were on relief rolls. And it was my job to expend the appropriation laid aside by a congressional vote for the relief of the unemployed as it related to the field of theater." Starnes jumped back in at this point and introduced another line of attack, painting Flanigan as a communist. He began with a background. She had spent some time as one of the first women to win a Guggenheim Award. She had gone to Europe, including Russia, to study theater and bring back what she had learned. And Starnes started reading from an essay she had written, "A Theater is Born," that she had written for a publication called Theater Arts Monthly in 1931. He was quoting what she wrote in the review, and she explained there's a difference between observing something and reporting on it. And she tried to explain to him that he was merely quoting her account of a conference she had attended rather than her own views. But she knew where the line of attack was heading. Was the Federal Theater promoting propaganda? Since it was impossible to deny that a few of its plays, especially what were called the living newspaper dramas, were committed to political and social advocacy, Flanigan, while acknowledging that these were propagandistic, insisted that they were propaganda for democracy, propaganda for eliminating slums, for better health care, for fairer labor practices. She concluded that propaganda is, in the end, education, to which Starnes had no answer. It was time again for Martin Dies to step in. He began by asking Hallie Flanagan about the audiences the Federal Theater reached. By that time, 25 million Americans had seen at least one of its productions, and for Flanagan, that was a great mark of its success. But for Martin Dies, it was evidence of how influential the Federal Theater had become, and if some of its plays were truly un-American, how dangerous an institution. Flanigan then refuted the accusation that the Federal Theater couldn't get any audiences except for communist plays, pointing out that in its brief life, the Federal Theater had made political affiliations with every type of education and civic body in the country, churches, synagogues, every kind of veterans association. It had fully connected with the nation. Starnes was not yet done. Failing to see the web that Martin Dies was slowly weaving to trap Hallie Flanagan, and still sure that she had confessed to communist sympathies in her article, he forced his way back into the conversation, reading aloud what he believed to be the most incriminating quotation in her work. And I'll read from it as he did. "Unlike any art form existing in America today, the workers' theaters intend to shape the life of this country socially, politically, and industrially. They intend to remake a social structure without the help of money, and this ambition alone invests their undertaking with a certain Marlowe-esque madness." Confident that this was damning evidence of socialist sympathies, Starnes demanded to know, "You are quoting from Marlowe. Is he a communist?" It was a question he would regret asking until his dying day. In fact, his obituary led with it. The Herald Trib called it the high comedy relief of the day. Flanigan, the congressional room exploded with laughter. Flanigan, embarrassed because she had joined in it, apologized for her rude response, and then just said, "I was quoting from Christopher Marlowe."
Starn still did not get it. Tell us who this Marlowe is so we can get the proper reference, because that is what we want to do. To which she said, put it in the record, he was the greatest dramatist in the period of Shakespeare, immediately preceding Shakespeare. Starnes, who was reddened at this point, salvaged what he could and asked whether all drama, since its origins in ancient Greece, was fundamentally about social conflict and so, by extension, communist. Surely, he said, Mr. Euripides was guilty of teaching class consciousness. She wasn't going to back down on Euripides. She was married to a classics professor, and probably that was part of his attack as well. Drama, going back to the Greeks, had always been about social conflict and questioning the status quo. Flanigan might have added that this helped account for why millions of Americans in the midst of a depression were flocking to see federal theater productions. But how could she explain that without further incriminating the federal theater in promoting class conflict to a committee that found any questioning of the way things were so threatening? Euripides, Marlowe, Shakespeare, Moliere, it made no difference to the committee. If theater advocated social change, it was, by default, subversive and communistic and therefore un-American, and something the United States of America should not be funding. Thomas then took over the questioning, steering the conversation towards specific plays. He failed spectacularly to make inroads with a children's play called Revolt of the Beavers, which he tried to label as communistic. It kind of was. The New York Times called it, Mother Goose Marx. But none of the committee members had seen any of these plays, and Hallie Flanagan had come prepared with testimonies from 6- and 7-year-olds who had seen the play. The play, one wrote, teaches us never to be selfish. Another child wrote, it is better to be good than bad. Thomas's line of attack was heading nowhere, so he turned to an example that had really infuriated him, a play called Injunction Granted. The play Injunction Granted quoted from the record of New Jersey legislation, and he, before he had joined Congress, had been a legislator in New Jersey and was furious that the lines actually spoken by these legislators had ended up in the play. Hallie Flanagan said, how could he object to what had actually been said? To which he had no answer. But a fundamental problem Hallie Flanagan was realizing as the hours rolled by was that these congressmen didn't grasp how plays worked or how dramatists, through their characters and dialogue, pitted competing points of view against each other, so that it was misguided to quote any single speech and conclude that it was somehow representative of a play's message. Might as well say, she responded, that the March of Time, a famous newsreel of the 30s, because it quotes from Stalin is communist, or because it quotes from Hitler is fascistic. It was now late morning, and it was left to Martin Dies to reverse what was at this point going quite badly for his committee. Once again, he began disarmingly, and he was really one of the smoothest orators ever to serve in Congress. He asked Flanagan whether the purpose of the Federal Theater was amusement or the teaching of a particular idea, the presentation of facts or material in a way to leave a definite impression. The question seemed innocuous enough, and Dies kept returning to it, rephrasing it as he patiently and inexorably approached what both he and Hallie Flanagan knew was being centrally contested. Should the Federal Theater be used to convey ideas along social, political, and economic lines? Flanagan, sensing a trap, asked him to leave out the word political, and he agreed, and asked, is it correct to use the Federal Theater to educate people, audiences along social or economic lines? And she grudgingly admitted, among other things, yeah. That was all Martin Dies needed to hear. And he spent the next hour delving into exactly how the various federal theater plays were leftist propaganda intended to foment class struggle and undermine what for him were essential American values. The only moment that he dropped his folksy courtroom manner and turned icy was when, discussing a federal theater musical then in rehearsal called Sing for Your Supper, he couldn't resist reminding Flanigan of the power he wielded. The show might well reach the stage, he said, unless you're interrupted by lack of funds or some action by Congress. Having set aside for the moment the loaded term communist, Dies steadily and with increasing success forced Flanigan to acknowledge that federal theater plays did indeed raise issues pertaining to social class, and he asked whether taxpayers should pay for plays that portray the interest of one class to the interest of another, even though what those plays say might be accurate. When she replied, "We're not interested in stirring up class hatred," he responded, "That is a matter of opinion." And he then succeeded in getting Hallie Flanagan to concede that a play called Power, which was about the creation of the Tennessee Valley Authority, establishing a publicly owned utility providing inexpensive electricity for the underserved, had advocated public ownership of utilities. Too late, Flanagan saw where this was going, saying, "It's a very clever move on your part to maneuver me into a certain position." Dies, having succeeded in doing just that, said, "I wouldn't undertake to match my cleverness with you on this subject because you're so thoroughly acquainted with it." He asked her, "Where does the federal theater draw a line on advocacy? At public ownership of utilities? Public appropriation of private property?" Flanagan knew where hitting down this path would lead, as she put it, to recommending the overthrow of the United States government, not what she intended. But Dies was relentless, insisting that she specify what sort of advocacy went too far, or alternatively conclude that she wanted to change America's political and economic systems incrementally. It was really enthralling to watch the exchange at this point. The Baltimore Sun would publish their exchange as if it was a scene from a stage play the following day. Barton Dies was now almost done, and shifting gears, he read aloud provocative lines from a 1934 play called Stevedore that had been an off-Broadway hit and had subsequently been revived by the Federal Theater. Here's how the Baltimore Sun described his exaggerated performance as he read aloud from this play. Martin Dies' recital began with a blasphemy and went on from there until the committee chairman, with an apparent shudder, halted himself. My book is filled with congressmen being bad actors, and this might have been the biggest overacting scene. And Dies came upon the following lines. "Do I look like some kind of animal? Do I look like somebody who jump over a back fence and rape a woman?" "Absolutely vulgar lines," Dies almost hissed. The lines he reproduces, and probably the voice he mimicked, are those of a black laborer named Lonnie, spoken when defending himself from a false accusation that he had raped a white woman. But that storyline at a time when black men were still being lynched in America, which explains why an outraged and terrified Lenny is cursing, is not what concerned Dies. For him, the passage was about blasphemy and obscenity that the Federal Theater was peddling, salacious language that the press, he knew, and he was right, would report on. But this was as close as Martin Dies would venture that day to the volatile issue of race, which was just below the surface of so much of the testimony about the Federal Theater. He was well aware that over the past 3 years, the Federal Theater had broken many long-standing racial barriers, allowing whites and blacks to perform together, staging all-black productions before integrated audiences, even in Jim Crow states like Texas, that had previously outlawed such productions, and pouring federal dollars into Negro units across America. But Dies, who was as staunch a foe of black equality as one was likely to find in Congress, knew better than to risk alienating the Northern press, and also knew that by law the federal theater was required to be non-discriminatory. After Martin Dye's performance, Thomas tried once again to get back into the fray, failing to understand that the show was over. Martin Dye cut him off, asked what time it was, and when he was told it was already 1:15, called for an adjournment to be followed by a fresh witness. Hallie Flanagan was stunned. "Just a minute, gentlemen. Do I understand that this concludes my testimony?" When Dodge replied, "We'll see about it after lunch," she insisted on making a final statement. To which Martin Dye, who had no intention of allowing such a formidable adversary any more time to make her case, said once more, "Well, we'll see about it after lunch." As the hearing broke up, Congressman Thomas approached Flanigan, she recalled, looking jovial, and said, "You don't look like a communist. You look like a Republican." She told him that she wanted to continue testifying after lunch, and Thomas laughed and said, "We don't want you back. You're a tough witness, and we're all worn out." Flanigan approached the secretary of the committee, Robert Stripling, and asked that her written brief be included in the congressional record. She handed it to him, and he assured her that it would be. It never was. When Hallie Flanagan testified that day, she more than held her own, Variety magazine awarding her the first round in her skirmish with the Dyes Committee. But that was no longer enough. Soon after she and Martin Dyes debated the place of theater in American democracy, Gallup released the results of one of its first national polls. Americans wanted the Dyes show renewed for one more season. A significant majority, 3/4 of Americans who had heard of the Dyes Committee, supported its ongoing investigations. 2 months later, 20,000 supporters of Adolf Hitler gathered under giant swastikas at an anti-Semitic and anti-communist rally in Madison Square Garden in New York, where President Roosevelt was mocked as Franklin Rosenfield. The crowd gave a giant ovation to Father Charles Coughlin of Detroit, Adolf Hitler, and Benito Mussolini, and words of praise were voiced as well for Martin Dyes. 6 months later, the Federal Theater was killed off by act of Congress, reluctantly signed by FDR 6 months later, while the House Un-American Activities Committee survived until 1975. It's hard to imagine what America would be like today had support for a federal theater continued and the Dyes Committee not been renewed. Counterfactual history is best left to novelists. But a more vibrant theatrical culture extending across the land might have led to a more informed citizenry, and by extension, a more equitable and resilient democracy. What happened instead was that Martin Dyes begat Senator Joe McCarthy, who begat Roy Cohn, who begat Donald Trump. What begins as an attack on theater never ends there. Thank you, and I welcome your questions, comments, and feedback. I think there is a microphone up here. I'm going to encourage you, since this is being filmed, to step up to the mic. And if you don't want to do so and ask a question, I'll repeat that question for the audience listening in and probably change it to one I can answer more easily. So it's better to use the mic.
So Jim, what I don't exactly get is, okay, I know Dyes was very charismatic and everything, but this theater project was extremely popular, as you said. I mean, millions of people attended the production. So I don't understand why the popular opinion seemed in favor of what Dyes was trying to do.
That's a really great question. And I would say, looking back, it's hard for me to understand why public opinion was so solidly behind Martin Dyes. and this is the best answer I can give you. He seduced the media in such a way that the New York Times gave 500 column inches in just 2 months of his testimony. And the Times was to the left of 90% of the papers in the country. So the media was feeding a desire to support the Dies Committee. And there was very little organized support. The Federal Theater could not lobby. It could not even use public relations figures. Hallie Flanagan begged her advisors to let her consult with them. So she had to fight a battle with a hand tied behind her back. By 1938, Americans were tired of people on the dole. And this was an easy way of saying, we're tired and we're done with it. President Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, loved Hallie Flanagan, brought her into the White House, but he did not want to use cultural capital to support her. And I'll mispronounce his name. Somebody will correct me. Harold Ikes or Ickes. Harold Ickes wrote a brilliant and withering and non-existent today speech called something like Rolling the Dies, to attack Martin Dies. And they had dirt on him and on his financial misdemeanors. But Roosevelt told him he could not deliver that speech on the eve of its delivery. So this is a kind of case study in support from Hollywood and Broadway and other arts groups came too late. Support from the federal government came too late, and they just were steamrolled. It's hard now to understand this in the same way that 100 years from now or 90 years from now, people are going to look back at 2016 and say, how did that happen? Or at 224 and say, how did that happen again? And those of us still alive at that time will be hard-pressed to answer that question. Next up, fire away. This is your chance.
So at the top of the hour, I think it was said that most of us have probably never heard of this. So I'm curious how you came across it and why you decided to write a book, and how did you find all the information?
Those are 3 great questions. First of all, it must sound like my mom, when I was 4 years old and she was reading to me, was reading from Hallie Flanagan's book, Arena, describing the Federal Theater, written in 1940. I didn't really know about the Federal Theater at all when I began this project. And I knew of one great production. Orson Welles, at the age of 20, was given directorship of the classical wing of the so-called Negro unit in Harlem, in New York City. And John Houseman had asked him to stage a classical play. And he decided to stage Macbeth, which had a cast of 150 black actors. And it's generally known as Voodoo Macbeth. I think of it as the Macbeth in Harlem. Voodoo does a kind of disservice to that element of the story. But I knew this as a Shakespearean in the back of my head. Oh yeah, there was this great production of the play, which was the first great hit of the Federal Theater. I began this book 4 years ago. COVID made doing research of any kind in archives extreme. It made everything difficult, but archives were closed. And it meant that you had to depend upon the kindness of librarians. And all the material for the Federal Theater was federal property, so that when I needed to understand things about the Dies Committee or the funding and disposition of the Federal Theater, I needed to go to the Library of Congress and I needed to go to the National Archives. And I eventually did go to both places in person, but I relied heavily on the support of librarians who photocopied immense amount of work for me from those archives and other ones around the country. Martin Dies in Texas, Hallie Flanagan at Vassar, and at the New York Public Library and elsewhere. So I was able to amass a lot of information, and having lived since 2016 in this country, I was sensitive to that Republican playbook and realized how much of it had originated with Martin Dies of Texas. There's one more part of this story that made possible this book. When FDR signed a statement closing the Federal Theater, every production shut that night. There was a production of Pinocchio in New York City. And instead of having him live at the end of the play, the actors quickly changed it to Pinocchio dying at the end of the play. And that made front page news around the country. It meant that sets were sold off, costumes were sold off or taken home and disappeared. And all the scripts and posters and materials for these productions were sent back to Washington, D.C. And somebody, I don't know if anybody here works at the Library of Congress or another major institution, but institutions have short-term memory loss. And nobody remembered where they had put the Federal Theater material. They knew in the early 1960s it had been boxed up in crates and sent somewhere. Luckily, one of the old-timers at the Library of Congress was still around, and he led two intrepid professors from George Mason University who were committed to finding these materials. And they ended up going to a deserted a deserted airplane hangar outside of Baltimore, and they found, covered in pigeon droppings, these giant crates which had been abandoned. And in those crates were plays that some of which had never been staged, most of which had never been printed. And George Mason University retrieved this material, and God bless them, they decided to interview everybody who was still alive in 1976 when this recovery took place. Over the next few years, everyone involved in the public theater, and got their stories and put them up online where you can listen to them today. The Library of Congress was not happy about being one-upped and having tripped up. They demanded the materials back. So these materials are now back in the Library of Congress, but thank God for those two professors from George Mason. So that's a long and a short answer into how I stumbled upon this. There's one more part of that answer that is significant for me. I'm an English professor, a Shakespeare professor, but for the last 15 or 20 years, I've also worked as an advisor to theater productions. So I've worked with the Royal Shakespeare Company. I've worked with the Public Theater in New York, which is the great heir of the Federal Theater. It sends mobile units to prisons and halfway houses for free. It tries to make theater accessible in that way. So I've gotten the chance to experience what it means to bring theater to underserved audiences and how grateful people are. You know, you sit in the audience at Rikers jail actually, in New York City, and you watch people who have never seen a play before taking in Much Ado About Nothing, acted by Broadway actors. And if I answer questions before the actors get their costumes on and come out, I'm asked questions like, how many plays did Shakespeare write? Is he still alive? You know, those kinds of questions. And I'm watching audiences whoop and holler, watching plays, not knowing that they're supposed to be like you, sitting politely, listening, rather than interactive with that. So I'm aware in a very visceral way of what is lost when we lost that federal theater. When the federal theater went to Nebraska and movies had wiped out theater in Nebraska, people in Lincoln stood outside the stage door because they did not believe these actors were human beings. And they needed to see them because they were confused. They thought it was some kind of innovative movie rather than live performance. So this is where we were in the 1930s in this country. Next question. Ask away.
What happened to the costumes?
What happened to the costumes? Anybody here ever get involved with their kid's third grade play or sixth grade play? People take things home. People think, well, you know, the government's going to throw this away. My church is doing a creche play next week. We could use this Hamlet costume. They disappeared. Things just disappeared, as they do in real life. So we don't have costumes from the Federal Theater, but we do have fantastic drawings of those costumes because the Federal Theater hired terrific artists or drew on musicians and artists from the other divisions within Federal One. And if you're curious, after this evening, just go to the Library of Congress, type in Federal Theater, and you can spend the next 3 months, as I did, looking through costumes, scripts, stage sets. It's both exhilarating and profoundly depressing because this chapter in our nation's history simply got blotted out.
Let me try one more. So, you know, after the demise of the Federal Theater, right, it was 3 decades or something before the government got back into the business of funding the arts and set up the NEA. So how was the establishment of the National Endowment for the Arts influenced by the experience with the federal project?
That is a great Washingtonian question. I love the fact that LBJ, as a young congressman, voted to end the Federal Theater. And then when he's President, Johnson signs the legislation into law promoting the National Endowment for the Arts and the Humanities. The winds had shifted. There was one valuable lesson that the NEA had learned that Hallie Flanagan had failed to master. You have to make every congressional district get part of the action. And one of the brilliant things about the NEA is it punishes not simply if you cut its funding, and there have been repeated attempts to cut its funding that have failed, because its funding is no longer primarily in New York and Chicago and LA. Its funding is in Peoria. Its funding is in Sioux City. Its funding is in every congressional district. So congressmen and congresswomen are anxious about their constituents in a way that their predecessors in the late 1930s did not have to be. And it's still endangered. And it's not simply the loss of a federal theater. For those of you who follow the news, you know that drama teachers in this country, 85% of drama teachers are terrified about censorship. And that plays about Matthew Shepard in Kansas, or even in the great state of Florida, you can't stage complete or even teach complete Romeo and Juliet to ninth graders anymore because of its alleged sexual content. So the Dies Playbook is alive and well in this country. And one of the reasons I've written this book is to alert citizens not simply what we have lost, but what we are now in danger of losing further still.
Yeah, does the New York Public Theater idea exist elsewhere in, if not Chicago, in Peoria or wherever? How broadly has that idea of local government, or yeah,
That's
how
it's a great
broad has
question.
that?
Why isn't what public theater's doing sprouting up all over the country?
Right,
The answer is money.
right.
There are places in Minnesota, in Chicago, in San Diego at the Old Globe that try to create and float these kind of projects. They are extremely expensive. And the advantage of the public theater that does free Shakespeare in the Park and every summer that 50,000 New Yorkers line up to go see is people are very generous in their donations. And, we're lucky to get that. But in the last 3 years, the New York Public Theater has had to shed a third of its staff. And right now, its executive director, artistic director, Oscar Eustace, is begging congressmen and congresswomen to support not-for-profit theater at a moment when almost every major theater company in this country is hemorrhaging money, and in the aftermath of COVID, hemorrhaging subscribers who tend to be older and more fearful of contracting COVID. These are dire times for not-for-profit theater. So it's not even as if we can imitate the New York Public Theater. The New York Public Theater is having trouble doing what it does right now. Thank you. Ask away. Very cheerful responses I'm giving you.
Since she seemed to be the main spokesperson, what happened to Hallie Flanagan?
I love Hallie Flanagan. I really, really do. I love her so much. I refuse to put in the book the fact that one of these things I picked up from those interviews published by George Mason. She was extremely vain and sent away to Paris for these red, perfectly fitted wigs. I think she had 6 of them. I left that out because I didn't want to kind of diss Hallie Flanagan. Hallie Flanagan lost her job as director of the Federal Theater, went back to Vassar. And the Rockefeller Foundation gave her some money to write a book about the Federal Theater, which is an extraordinary book called Arena. And I highly recommend it. And she realized you can't really go home again. So she transferred to Smith College in Massachusetts. That didn't really work. And shortly thereafter, in the late 1940s, sadly, she contracted Parkinson's disease, went back to Vassar. Her husband died of a heart attack while all this was going on. She blamed the Dies Committee and all that for it as well. She was put in a home. She could just watch TV, and she started hallucinating that in the hallways, people were calling her a communist, and they were out to get her still. So when I said to her dying days she was haunted by this, to her dying days she was haunted by it. She felt everything she had tried in her life had come to nothing. It's a really sad story. And she had only become a theater person. She was a good housewife in Iowa, but her husband died, leaving her with 2 kids, and she had to teach, and she became interested in drama. So I'm trying to resurrect interest in her. I've asked the American Academy of Arts and Sciences to belatedly acknowledge her and make her a member, because she's one of the great voices in this country that we've lost that did good. Thank you for asking, and I'm sorry about yet another non-upbeat response. Please.
Hi. I read in a review some comment that Orson Welles and John Houseman made that was very critical of the African American. Could you
Yeah.
elaborate on that?
This is one of those say it ain't so, Joe moments. I love Orson Welles. I love John Houseman. They were unknown in 1936. John Houseman only became the guy who ran the Harlem unit because Rose McClendon, one of the great African American actors, died, I think, of cancer in that year. And they figured, let's have a white guy do this. There'll be less friction. And he brought in Orson Welles to direct rather than talented black directors who were directing Macbeth up in Boston. And the previous play they had intended to do was their first Broadway production, and it was called Ethiopia. And it was a living newspaper, by which I mean it was kind of, they had journalists research it and turn it into a stage play with a cast of 150 or so. And Ethiopia was about Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, about which the United States was kind of quiet at the time. But the play was critical of Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia. Anyway, they sent down to D.C. to get a clip of President Roosevelt making a speech. The State Department caught wind of this production, and they said, "No way, you are not doing this play. Forget about it." And Harry Hopkins, 6 months earlier, would say, this is going to be a free and uncensored theater. Well, their first play was censored by the State Department. And at the center of this play was an African troupe of drummers and who had stayed in America, picked up some African Americans as well. They were out of work. So Hallie Flanagan sent them to the Harlem unit, and Orson Welles couldn't believe his good luck and put them at the center as voodoo doctors in this Macbeth production. And these were Broadway stars, this company. They had done a show called Kyankor briefly before this on Broadway. They were known. Welles, Houseman were unknown. Anyway, about 15 years later, the story gets completely rewritten by Orson Welles saying, "Oh yeah, we sent to Africa for this troupe, and these guys all had gold teeth, and they spoke funny, and I'm not kidding you, they really did." Just utter nonsense, elevating his role, denigrating their role. So, I try to call it as I see it in the book, as much as I love Orson Welles.
We got time for one more.
This is the last question.
Quick follow-up to that.
Yeah.
That Harlem Macbeth goes to Dallas. I'm wondering if you found any connection. It's wildly controversial, wildly popular. Is Dies irritated by that? Because there is, that production, a lot of it disappears in Dallas. Right?
Yeah.
They dismantle a lot of it. Things, as you were saying, go missing. The Aaron Douglas paintings that surrounded the African, Hall of Arts go missing. So I'm just wondering, is there any Texas connection there? When it goes to Dallas, it creates such a stir. I'm wondering if that's part of the irritant.
Yeah. After playing in Harlem, Macbeth went to Broadway, and then it went on a national tour. They had 6-car train take them all over. And one of the things you discover when you are 150 black actors is there are not a lot of hotels that are going to take 150 black actors in America in 1936. And they found accommodations in churches and black communities. And then they went to Dallas for the centennial there. Martin Dies was from the 2nd Congressional District on the Louisiana border, so he wasn't a Dallas guy. He was an East Texas guy. And I don't even know if he was aware of it, but if you look at the newspaper accounts of it in Dallas, they're kind of shameful. And white folk did not turn out to see blacks play Shakespeare. I want to thank you all. I want to thank Politics and Prose. Again, a real thrill being at this bookstore.
Oh, thank you, Jim. Copies of his book are available at the checkout desk at the front. He'll be up here